The TCG Design Theory podcast is part of the Booster Pack Network. For more TCG-related content, visit theboosterpacknetwork.com. Hosting for this show is sponsored by Category 1 Games, the go-to shop for all of your classic TCG needs. Find your favorites or discover something new at category1games.com.
All right, hey everybody, welcome to the TCG Design Theory podcast. Today I have Rands Lincoln, who is the creator of the CCG History YouTube channel, more specifically the Booster Pack podcast, and kind of just the CCG History network. I know you're very active on Twitter, and I think you got a couple other social media platforms, but Rands does a lot of things with his show just to kind of go into the details of the history of collectible card games and specific games and things like that. So thank you, Rands, for being on the show. How you doing?
I'm doing really well. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Appreciate having you on. So jumping right into the topic, TCGs have been around for almost 30 years at this point. Would you say about 93 is Magic's kind of started that out and everything?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I could pinpoint it to a date, but yeah, I mean, 2021 would be the 30th anniversary of when they first started getting designed. Yes.
So we're coming up on about 30 years, and obviously there's a lot of things that have not changed at all. And at the same time, so many things that have changed, innovations that have made huge waves and trends that have come and gone. But ultimately, it's like we were talking about before the show, just kind of this fascinating area of tabletop game space. But before we get started, can you provide a background of how you got involved with TCGs and collectible games and what drives you to keep going in this space?
Oh, absolutely. So I grew up in Australia, and I grew up in it was rural Australia at the time. It's very suburban Australia now. And my first memory of a collectible game, of course, as many people's, is Magic the Gathering. But my story doesn't really start there. I had my cousin give me my first lot of Magic cards at 5, and I tell you what, there was some black cards in the little pile that he gave me, and they scared the hell out of me. Like, I hid them in my room so that even I couldn't find them because I thought they'd give me nightmares. We're talking like revised era sort of stuff. So 1994 this would be. I think I would have been about 5. So I was really freaked out by them. I remember there was some dual lands in there that he gave me that must have been from revised as well, because the only thing I liked about him is that the little text box had the spiraling color in it. I wish I had kept on to them, but of course everybody says that about early Magic cards. And then my real journey with collectible card games as like a hobby really starts with, as many people in my generation do, Pokemon. I really get into Pokemon around about it's before 1999, but we could go into that very, very deep. But when the video game comes out, it's quickly followed by the collectible card game that comes out in English, or trading card game. And I get my first pack of that. Like, I vividly remember opening that pack and being completely ensconced by the entire experience. And I remember vividly thinking to myself, opening up the pack and going, some of this doesn't make sense to me, because I was a huge Pokemon fan at that stage. And there was some types that didn't make sense. Like, Diglett had a fighting type icon, and, Grimer was a grass type. And I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. Why is this happening? And I eventually found out there was a game involved with it, and that's why this was happening. And I actually traded some of my, semi-rare cards, uncommon cards, for a friend who had managed to get a rule book before anybody else could. And I absolutely tore apart that rule book and understood the mechanics of the game. And while other people in the playground had Pokemon cards, I was really the only one who was really super invested in the fact that there was a game associated with it. Everybody else was sort of, were happy to fight Pokemon cards, but didn't really understand the concepts, of course. So jumping forward, obviously I get really into Pokemon. I play sort of semi-competitively, but never really place any higher. At that stage, I'm like maybe 8 or 9, maybe 10 at the oldest. And I, again, as I said, was living in semi-rural Australia. And as the suburbs start growing up around me, one of the closest places to spend my pocket money was a news agency, which sold magazines mostly, but just behind the counter, just in this post-Pokemon wave, they started putting up like a little thing of sort of card booster packs. And as that would change, going to that store, they didn't really have comic books or anything like that. They had like the Archies and all those sort of like lame sort of newsstand comic books that, nobody really wants to love. But they did have trading card games behind there. And I picked up every single different one that came in. I really had to bug the newsagent guy, like as like a 10-year-old, please sir, get in some decks so I could get other games and learn how they play. But I played dozens of games from that experience. And then just to jump forward, from there, I sort of get interested in collectible card games, and I jump from card game to card game to card game. And essentially, one day, the big sort of getting awoken to the whole collectible card game genre, before I'd just seen it as these sort of merchandise for other sort of franchises and stuff, be it Pokemon, be it Sailor Moon, be it Dragon Ball Z, be it Digimon, anything like that. I always just saw them as an adjunct to this. As I walked into a thrift store, as I was getting, 14, 15, 16, I can't remember exactly what age, but there was a giant, literally giant box of all these 90s trading card games, Rage and Galactic Empires and some Magic, but not much, all those sort of old collectible card games. And I grabbed that box for, I can't remember, it would be $10, not even, like it was literally thousands and thousands of cards. And from then, that moment, I've been obsessed with collectible card games, trading card games, the genre, and everything all on it. And, you so kindly mentioned that I do CCG history, which personally I started it way back, I think around about 2013, and we'll talk about why a little bit later. But I see myself at this point as an advocate for some of the collectible card games that haven't gotten the love that I think that they have deserved over the years. Obviously everyone knows Pokemon, everybody knows Yu-Gi-Oh! They're massive international IPs and franchises. Everybody in the hobby game space knows Magic the Gathering because it is the collectible card game, and we'll get into why that is in a moment. But I sort of always advocated amongst even my friends personally about these other sort of outside games that I've really loved and fallen in love with. And I really just am as well an archivist for sort of the information around that. I am a traveler now. I live in Canada at this point, so I can't collect as much as I once did. I still have obviously my favorites and stuff like that hanging here, and some stuff in storage in Australia. But on top of that, I'm also a content creator. As you said, I'm a podcaster, and anything to do with sort of collectible card games, especially outside of the scope of those sort of big three games, and sort of the innovations that the other games have sort of brought to the table, and the things that they have done in that time.
And, this is an audio only podcast, but we're doing this interview over video. And of course, if you've seen Rand's show, or if you go and check out his show, in the videos, you'll see behind him a collection of books that says collectible card games, trading card games. And I find it so fascinating that you are that you label yourself as a CCG historian, essentially. Hearing how knowledgeable you are about the history of these types of games is really incredible. And there's just a lot to dive into: designers, artists, players, events, and everything else like that. So speaking of this business model, and I think, everybody can agree that Magic the Gathering is the thing that started the trading card game, but you said you had a specific date in mind. What was the actual beginning of this kind of game, trading card games and collectible card games?
So now this is where we get in trouble, because I know we've only got a limited time on this podcast, and I could literally talk for 3 hours just on the stuff that happened before Magic the Gathering launched, which you are correct. It is sort of the first real collectible card game to be released. Now, there is examples of games that sort of build themselves in like a randomized model and have a game based on it. But what we're really talking about in this particular genre is games that require players to collect a specific card pool and construct their own deck, and then shuffle that deck and play with it. Now, there is a couple of exceptions to that rule that I classify some other things that land outside of that as collectible games. But in this particular instance, collectible card games did indeed start with Magic. Magic was sort of the stone that sort of, put the ripple in the lake and brought out the entire genre. So when we talk about the very beginning, we talk about, of course, Magic the Gathering's creator, Richard Garfield. But Richard Garfield started he was a maths professor, well, not professor at the time. He was studying his doctorate in 1991, and he ended up becoming acquainted with Peter Atkinson, who was championing a role-playing game company over in Seattle at the time called Wizards of the Coast, which we very much know that name nowadays quite well. But at the time, it was just a tiny little company being run out of a basement. And what happened is, essentially, just to cut through very quickly, Richard was trying to sell a board game. Peter said, I don't have enough money to make a board game. Let's make a card game. Richard had this idea of like players having their own cards and being able to do this stuff. I mean, again, I'm making this a fantastic story abridged in a few seconds. This is like the trailer version. But essentially, he brings to Wizards of the Coast Magic the Gathering. And it's developed over a 2-year period from middle of 1991 to 1993. And then eventually it releases sort of has a soft sort of demo in July 1993, and then actually gets fully launched in August 1993. Now, what we're talking about when we talk about collectible card games, trading card games, is this term. You said it's a business model, it's a marketing term, trading card game. So using that as basically our jumping on point, that term is very specific to some games. Like, you'll notice there is card games, there is customizable card games, there is all sorts of games, but they don't fall into this same collectible card game sort of genre.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting that you're talking about. Before Magic, there being these games that had a randomized part to them, a collectability aspect of them, but this very specific model of, hey, I want the players to have their own cards, I want them to be collectible, and giving that a shot, and then continuing to just improve upon it and build upon it from there. So with that, what are some of the major eras that have occurred in the past 30 years? I know just from listening to your show that the success of Magic, the overwhelming, crazy miracle success of Magic that just seemed to sweep through game stores like a wildfire, obviously spurred everybody else, like with any other kind of innovation, to say, hey, well, if they can do it, I can do it, and I have this IP, I have this cartoon or movie or book that I already own the rights to. So if I make a game out of it, I can be successful. So talking about the initial boom of the trading card game industry, and then moving forward with where that's gone from there since.
Now, if your first question was going to give me 3 hours of conversation, this one could fill 12 hours, because it is really fascinating. Now, I do want to define some things before we jump in here. Now, you're asking me about the eras of collectible card games and or trading card games, and let's just define that before we get any further. In today's episode, or whatever, I'm just going to define how I actually see the term trading card game and collectible card game and how they relate to one another. Basically, they're the same thing. Essentially, when Magic launched, it was billed by its very first commercial as a collectible trading card game set. So essentially what happened is when Magic came out, that was sort of the label it was given. Initially, they sort of toyed around with this collectible word to sort of get into the market and sort of spurn sales, because initially people approached it as a collectible, as if it was any other trading card game set, and some people approached it as a game. But as they went more into the game side of things and away from sort of the extreme collectability that sort of, they were initially sort of going for, they pivoted their marketing to trading card game. Now, at that point, the distributors who were wanting to sell some stuff actually said collectible card game is going to be a more catchy term for sales purposes and stuff like that. And this is 100% an abridged version of this story. But when we say collectible card game and trading card game, Wizards of the Coast did sort of spearhead both of those terms. They sort of used trading card game to initially define Magic, and then everything else was a collectible card game. They sort of used this, these differing terms to sort of set themselves apart from the market. So when I say collectible card games, which I believe, and we could go into it, but again, this is another hour of conversation, that is the genre, and trading card game is a marketing term that is given to specific games. Certain games like Magic are a trading card game. Pokémon is a trading card game. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a trading card game. And because those big games all use that particular terminology, that's why TCG is one of the most sort of pervasive sort of terms for this type of game. But collectible card game, or CCG, which is something that can encompass many other games as well, and just the entire industry. And there's some nuances we'll get into in a second about why some companies use that term and whatnot. That is really just the actual sort of umbrella term for everything, whereas trading card game, in my opinion, is specific to certain games. Now, back to your original question, how do you define the eras of all of this stuff? Now, it's very tricky because also, although it started in America, this is a art form or a medium that is also permeated throughout the world. So everything I talk about today is specifically from an American-centric point of view, because that's where the genre started. We won't be going into where things happened in Europe and where things happened in Japan and stuff like that. And those timelines really conflict. So the eras I'm defining today are going to be basically based on American collectible card games or trading card games for the most part. And what we really have to do in this particular case is look at what we can sort of, parallel collectible card games or trading card games with, and that is comic books. So comic books, if you ask any sort of comic book historian, you will see that those comic books have different eras. There's the Golden Age, and there's the Silver Age, and there's the Bronze Age, and then I don't know how they've dealt with recent things because it was the Modern Age for so long, and I think we're in another age now. And I really find those terms to be broken because once you label something the Modern Age, it can't be that forever. So let's talk about what I consider the first age of collectible card games, which is what you were talking about, Magic the Gathering and sort of the boom. So this is a sort of period where Magic the Gathering comes out and sort of sends a ripple through the hobby games market, which is where it was really marketed. It was marketed to people who were playing Dungeons and Dragons. It was marketed to college students who had extra money. And what really happened then is Magic really started this fervor from other game companies because if you look at Magic the Gathering or any trading card game really from the outside, and I'm sure a lot of people do that, especially nowadays, you will think that it is such an easy thing to do. You know, it's printing cards with words on them that are rules and stuff like that. It's such an easy sort of task to make. There's no miniatures to make. There's nothing like that. You print a rule book, you print some cards, and you're done. Obviously, there's a lot of complexity that I'm sure you're going to explore later on your show. But with Magic the Gathering, they launch. And then obviously the hobby games market catches up. 1994 has 9 releases. And 1995 has over 40 releases. That's like sort of a boom year. And then some other interesting things sort of happen. You know, once you sort of get all these things in the market, collectible or trading card games are a lifestyle thing and they need certain inertia or critical mass to sort of stay relevant and keep people playing, especially in these sort of pre-internet eras, like where it hadn't really been a big online sort of presence for these sort of things. So if somebody's playing in a local game store, they need a certain mass of people to be playing the same game that they're playing when it comes to collectible games. So Magic brings on this boom in 1995 of these other games, and eventually most of them die out. This is sort of the first age. And then what sort of happens is Wizards of the Coast releases a few more games and stuff in this period. And ultimately, what happens at the end of this age is the Wizards of the Coast gets a patent for collectible card games or trading card games, but we can go into that another time. And that sort of makes the entire hobby industry sort of taper off. So from 1993 to 1998, there's this sort of period where everybody's sort of launching these amazing Magic sort of clones or these other collectible card games based on whether it's licenses, like you mentioned, or whether it's based on other hobby, role-playing games, because that's the market they're sort of appealing to. And as I said, there's a crash and then there's a pattern that sort of makes people sort of taper off. And by 1998, I think there's only 7 games released or so. And I think most of those are from Wizards of the Coast at that point.
And so you would say for that very beginning part of this 30-year stretch, you had the major boom of a bunch of essentially copycats, people trying to follow the coattails of the success of Magic, jump up real quick, fizzle out and burn. And then you had kind of those few that endured from 1998 onward.
That's correct. So especially in that period, you had a lot of game companies that were already making things. The biggest example of which was TSR, who was making Dungeons and Dragons at the time. And they jumped on the bandwagon. They were the actual second people to get sort of in the pool. They had a whole bunch of art from their D&D books. They could just slap together some rules and make a release, which essentially was Spellfire. And then they followed that up with another collectible card game. And they didn't quite put the care. As we mentioned before, there was 2 years of development that Magic the Gathering had. And Spellfire sort of came out in the space of, within a year of Magic coming out, and much less of that time was spent on actually developing the game. So there are a lot of people riding coattails. There's a lot of copycat clones that sort of are doing Magic light things. And these sort of behaviors and stuff from the other competitors in the industry are what leads to Wizards of the Coast, applying for their patent and stuff like that, which is a heavily misunderstood thing when we talk about it in collectible games history, but we don't need to talk about it now. But you are absolutely right. So they have this big coattail sort of ride of all these other collectible card games coming out, but there are some that endure. The ones like that are based on some really high tier franchises like Star Trek and Star Wars, and especially one that the most inspiring one from this era is Legend of the Five Rings, in my opinion, because it was another game that was coming out as an original property that really focused on game design, focused on doing something completely original and stuff like that. And that sort of period where there's nearly, I think it's about 93 or 94 games in that sort of 5-year stretch. I'd have to double check. Is something where all of those games were being marketed towards college students, people who are in the hobby game industry. It was a real capturing the D&D crowd, real hobby centric sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've listened to the episode, and for those listening now, definitely got to check out your episode that kind of covers some of the history behind Legend of the Seven Rings, because
Five Rings.
Sorry, Legend of the Five Rings, because it seems like the time and care that went into the design of that game, and the particular focus on the community and the community involvement, which I think is extremely important, especially for games nowadays, to be so far ahead of its time. I think it really shows how it lasted as long as it did, and then it shows you how, even though this thing wasn't attached to any major known IP, how it was still head and shoulders above, the rest of the competition. So we hit 1998. Obviously, this is the time when, arguably around the time that Saturday morning cartoons are starting to become a thing. Like a really
well,
really,
really
like
that's a different thing altogether.
A really major thing with some of these franchises that are still going on today. So you have a lot of these things start to pop up, and of course, those games around those times start to really gain traction because of how popular their other forms of media are becoming. And in fact, as everybody knows, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is literally about a trading card game. So, making a trading card game was kind of the logical thing to happen there. So can you go into a little bit of what happens, at the beginning of that, and where that takes us from there?
So this is sort of begins what I call the second age of collectible card games or trading card games. Basically, what happens after 1998? That's sort of like a really lull for the releases. Like I said, there was only like 7 or so releases. It had really cooled off from that peak. But when we come into 1999, and it's in fact, Wizards of the Coast again, who actually makes a huge revolution, at least in the Western market. Something had been brewing over in Japan for the previous couple of years. But in the Western market, Wizards of the Coast is approached by a company called Game Freak in Japan, and are given this license to create this game that they're having huge success with in Japan in the Western market, and that is Pokemon. And that's sort of what leaning into what you just mentioned, these Saturday morning cartoon type things, which in fact were more like, like kids' afternoon cartoons or whatever, like these import cartoons from Japan. So what happens is Pokemon is a phenomenon. Absolutely crazy phenomenon. And what happens is Wizards of the Coast launches a very, very small production run of Magic the Gathering of Pokemon in 1999. And that's in January, which is, some people have called first edition and all that sort of stuff. And that sort of quickly sells out, very quickly, in fact. In fact, they thought they were going to make $4 million on Pokemon. And, to cut the story quickly short, they ended up making $400 million on Pokemon just in their first year. So obviously this boom, this, electric rat boom hits the market of collectible card games and every other property as well. But because cards are cheap, they're easily accessible, they're something that parents will buy for their kids on impulse. They've got colorful pictures on them and stuff like that. Like I mentioned before, I was very much allured by these as a kid too. Kids start getting into it, and kids start buying it regardless of whether there's a game attached to it or not. And what really happens is Pokemon inspires this whole wave of, cartoon-centric or kid-centric properties, I should say, to get their own collectible card games. Because once other companies start to see that there is this money and this value in collectible games, especially when they have this huge, phenomenon IP sort of attached to them. And as, everybody's going to know, Pokemon trading card game is still going, and one of the most enduring examples. I think, just last year it celebrated 25 years. What happens is you start to see a whole bunch of other competitors sort of license things as quickly as possible and get them into the market. So in this second age, it's sort of a boom brought around by Pokemon this time. And where the first boom that I mentioned before was focused on college students and hobby gamers, this time, this boom is like focused on kids in the mass market. So you're talking about properties that go into places like Walmart's, places like Target's, places like Toys R Us's, not your, Dungeons Dragon or, Android's Dungeon or something like that, where you would normally expect to find hobby games. These things become they supplant things like sort of Topps collectible cards as sort of the go-to thing that people can sort of buy when it comes to these properties. Pokemon also had a range of Topps cards, but because of the timing of that, the Topps cards weren't nearly as popular as the trading card games because the trading card game was already out, right? And obviously it has that additional function that you can play it regardless of whether people want to play it or not. So in this boom, I sort of see this second age, this sort of more kid-centric, sort of IP-driven age of collectible card games, traveling from 1999 up to about 2008. Now, it gets a little bit murky towards the end there, but what you see things like, as we mentioned before, Pokemon, Digimon, Sailor Moon, all manner of kid-centric licenses, everything from Codename Kid Next Door to all sorts of like Neopets. I think was a really big hot website at the time that even got their own collectible card game. Tons of different things sort of get these sort of games at this era. Now, that's not to say there isn't other hobby-centric things that come out. In this era, you also see things like the amazing Warlord collectible card game, the amazing Verse System collectible card game, the amazing World of Warcraft collectible card game, but those things do not characterize this era. Those things are sort of outliers in this sort of kid boom. I do have the numbers somewhere, but these sort of kid franchise IP boom that we sort of see in the early 2000s, things like Magi Nation was an original property that actually had, was basically like a Pokemon or an anime style thing made in the US. That actually, sort of tried to capture that sort of same sort of fervor that Pokemon did. They all sort of come out in this era, and that is, by its definition, the second age. Now, there's a whole bunch of innovation that comes in with the design side when you come onto the second age, because you are basically building these games out of something that already exists. Because you're building a game out of an IP, you're thinking about what the IP lens to gameplay. So there's tons of innovation in this time. Although, because they're all basically, sold in mass markets, there's no real way for hobby, the people who are interested in playing the game really to gather, because game stores aren't really going to support them when things like Magic and, Pokemon now being an industry leader at this point are really sort of the focal points of people who want to play. So it's really fascinating to see this second age. I think it's the age I sort of came up in. And, I mentioned earlier, I jumped from game to game to game to game and franchise to franchise to franchise to franchise. All of those were characterized by the games in this particular sort of era, this second age.
And so this era beginning in 1998 or the early 2000s, obviously coming up with Pokemon, would you say that it wasn't just Pokemon, but also Yu-Gi-Oh kind of coming around the same time, that kind of, if it wasn't already this big boom at that time, just from Pokemon, which obviously is historically the most valuable franchise, I think, on the planet.
That's
think in
correct,
terms of
yeah.
all their forms of media. But then shortly after that, you had Yu-Gi-Oh, and if that wasn't enough of a swing at that time, that really is, those two things are really kicking that off. What would you say about Yu-Gi-Oh during that time, and how it affected kind of that second era, and then how those two things played off each other, Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, and where some of the differences were with the player bases? Because, like you said, a lot of players tend to stick with like one game, and I know you said you hop from game to game because the whole genre is fascinating. But how would you say those two kind of coming along at the same time, and what that did for trading card games moving forward?
So that is a great call out. So Yu-Gi-Oh is actually like a really special crown jewel in this sort of second age era, because Pokemon comes out, and initially, all of these other games start coming out. Like we mentioned Dragon Ball, we mentioned Digimon, and all of a sudden here comes this other franchise from Japan, and hobby game stores are looking at it like, oh, this is just another one. The only thing special about it is it's a card game about a card game. Like it's this franchise that's based on this other sort of element that other characters hadn't, sort of figured out. So what Yu-Gi-Oh does is Yu-Gi-Oh actually teaches its players how to play it while they're enjoying the other media, and then basically allows their fans to role play the characters when they go and actually use it. So not only are they playing a collectible card game based on a property, but they're experiencing and able to embody characters like Yugimoto, Seto Kaiba, and stuff like that. And that was a huge deal for me. Like, I literally got my first job so I could buy Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Like, there was no other reason that I wanted to do it other than the fact that I wanted to buy Yu-Gi-Oh cards on eBay. And I played competitively in that side and everything like that. Now, the interesting thing I think about Yu-Gi-Oh's influence is it really isn't felt until the third age, which we're going to get into a little bit later. But Yu-Gi-Oh in that specific time, definitely it was a much smaller mass market success than Pokemon was. But what was really fascinating was the fact that it actually was a better hobby market success because of that sort of collectible or trading card game first sort of idea, right? Like, you sort of had these people coming in going, I'm getting Yu-Gi-Oh cards not because I love Pikachu or Raichu, or I want to get Dragonite, or I want to get Charizard. You're getting people getting those cards going, I want Exodia, I want Pot of Greed, I want, Change of Heart. I want these super awesome cards that have a really cool effect in the game. I'm not really too concerned about what's pasted on them. Obviously, Blue Eyes White Dragon's a really cool creature and stuff like that. based on a magic creature. We can go into that another time. But it's absolutely amazing to watch this new sort of genre of people sort of come about and sort of be inducted. And I think that that's something, especially in collectible game history, that is really underwritten. Is Yu-Gi-Oh! While Pokemon brought a lot of eyes to collectible card games and a lot of collectors to collectible card games, I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Did the same, but brought a lot of players to collectible card games. And I'm sure there was tons of people who collected Pokemon, but then started playing with Yu-Gi-Oh! As well.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting to put it that way because Pokemon's literally built on got to catch them all, got to collect them all,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. And then to your point, Yu-Gi-Oh was very much built around, hey, we're gonna make this interesting anime, this interesting show. It's some of the first season when if you play by those rules, you're gonna have quite a time. But
Well, I mean, there's a whole deep dive into how the video games affected the TV show and everything like that. But again, we're only talking about American stuff. That's a Japanese conversation.
Yeah. So, and I remember, of course, playing all of that. Yu-Gi-Oh cards were the big thing for me when I first got in. So, but yeah, it's interesting that the show taught you how to play. So when you looked at that rule book, speaking from experience, when I got the Yu-Gi starter deck, I recognized every card. I recognized how to play. There are a few specific things that I was like, oh, okay, like I guess this is how it's actually done instead of you getting banished to the Shadow Realm. So you
get removed from play. I mean, the show doesn't mention the chain or how timing works or anything like that.
Right, exactly. But I mean, it even came down to when I would play my friends. Whoever won that game, the other person had to give them their most valuable card from the deck. Which for the next game was terrible for the person who just gave that card away.
Wait, are you saying you played Yu-Gi-Oh with Ante back in the day? Like, so you would
like ante up your yeah. Mm-hmm. And
wow, that's some early Magic sort of vibes right there. I love it. I would have never dared to do that when I was a poor kid.
Of course, and I didn't have any money. I was begging my parents to do it. I was like, please, I just lost my summon skull. I need this.
Well, Magic is the reason that first season has that anti-component and, put characters like Joey build their decks in that way. Again, another hour on a podcast in and of itself.
Yeah, there's a lot of content. Obviously, it's getting condensed, but yeah, it's just such an interesting way how that show not only affected, how people approach the game, but also how people play the game. It's like, oh, I understand that these are the rules, but I remember this part of the show and I kind of want to play it this way with these house rules and things like that. I remember that very much being a thing. So we have Pokemon, we have Yu-Gi-Oh, and like you said, we had all these more kid-centric games that are coming out at the same time. Where, in your opinion, does the second era stop and the third one begin?
So this is one of my favorite conversations to have about collectible games because basically, again, we're doing an America-centric thing, and what's happening in the other parts of the world, especially in Japan, is completely different. But in America, what happens is some big revolution comes. Actually out of Wizards of the Coast again, but not directly this time. So what happens is in 2000. Okay, let me just sort of paint a picture here. So from 2000, basically 1999 through to 2006 or so, distributors and publishers have been keen to just get new collectible card game, one after the other into the stores based on IPs because they thought the next one, surely Pokemon can't last forever. There's going to be a next one. And of course, we know that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is sort of that, but also not really. And Pokemon continues to endure. And what happens is as we're starting to taper off in this era of these sort of like super kids IP franchise things start coming out like at the tail end, you have Avatar: The Last Airbender getting its own card game. Shaman King, a lesser known but personal favorite of mine, anime was getting a card game. Things like Yu Yu Hakusho, all those sort of games are starting to get these like last runs. And as they start to sort of peter out, not sort of grabbing the sort of attention that say Pokemon or Dragon Ball or anything did in those early days, something happens in the hobby game space that captures all of the distributors and publishers' attention. And that is sort of two things coinciding. And what happens is, again, I didn't mention it during the second age, but during the second age, way in the background, there are two games that come out, both by the same designer, but from the same company as well, that are Call of Cthulhu and the Game of Thrones game, which at this point, there was no Game of Thrones TV show. It was purely based on the books, and Call of Cthulhu was based on the works of H.P. Lovecraft. And what happened is they're just sort of operating in the hobby game space alongside things like, like Warlord that I mentioned earlier, like WoW. They're just sort of biting on for crumbs. But what happens is Fantasy Flight says, I can't do we can't do randomized games anymore. We can't print cards to the point where people are going to be interested. It gets boring. So what we're going to do is we have these cards designed, but what we're going to do is we're going to release them as sort of a single fixed set, and release them as sort of like eventually they would call an expandable card game or a living card game. And what happens there is they release sort of these living card game sets for Call of Cthulhu, and it's their best-selling thing because people no longer, these sort of hobby gamers no longer have to buy randomized boosters. They're super excited. And Fantasy Flight Games sort of understands that, oh my God, this is a new way to sort of look at these sort of deck building competitive games, releasing everything as a brick, as it's like you have all the cards, you have access to everything straight away, just buy it straight off the shelf, no need for booster packs or anything like that. And they sort of, in this era, in this sort of like 2008, 2009 sort of era, sort of release these sort of games, and things like Android Netrunner start coming out. Things like Game of Thrones get reworked into an LCG or an expandable card game. And Star Wars ends up getting their very own and stuff like that. And the hobby market sort of becomes enraptured with not only this, but from the halls of Wizards of the Coast, somebody who would work for Wizards releases something called Dominion, which is a deck building game. Not to confuse people, but it's another type of hobby game where all the cards are presented in the box, but you build your deck and play it simultaneously. And those two types of card games become the sort of center point of the American hobby market. They become what distributors want to do. They think that collectible card games are basically dead and a fool's pursuit at this point. And essentially what happens then is all of those collectible card games start to die out because those distributors are like, well, what are we doing? We don't need to print box upon box upon box of randomized cards. We can just print these things as boxed card games, whether it be a deck building game or whether it be a living card game, more akin to the trading card game model. And sort of focuses on that. So there's very few collectible card games that come out between that sort of like, especially 2008, 2009 to 2013, 14, which is sort of the heyday of deck building games and, these non-collectible customizable card games, which for some companies call a living card game, but that's a sort of trademarked term, and other companies call it an expandable card game. And some card games get revived during this time. Card games like Doomtown from the 1990s, card games like Netrunner from the 1990s again, get revived during this time. And that's where the sort of focus really shifts as far as we see sort of the hobby card gaming market goes. And what this does is it sort of leaves a vacuum in the trading card game, collectible card game space. And in fact, between, I believe, if I've tracked it right, the years 2011, 2012, and 2013, in this third age that I'll define in a second, sort of are the lowest released years for American collectible card games. There's a few things that trickle out, mostly just mass market stuff that we sort of talked about before. But the thing that really is fascinating and interesting, that really sort of starts in 2009 in Japan, I believe, I don't know the exact date, but and then I think about 2011 in the West, is something called Weiss Schwarz, and that's an anime card game that sort of incorporates different franchises and stuff like that at the same time. You've got things like Sword Art Online and all these sort of different anime franchises getting pushed into this card game, and they start releasing sets, and slowly they start to build a following. And this is a company called Bushiroad. And in this third era, Bushiroad is sort of basically, not the high watermark, but definitely one of the major players as a distributor, because you have Weiss Schwarz doing all of this stuff throughout this sort of 2009 to 2013 period, where the publishers and the distributors don't believe in the collectible game model. And this company from the East is releasing these other games. So Weiss Schwarz catches on and gives them enough capital to sort of bring out their own original game, which is sort of the influence from Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is Card Fight Vanguard, which is another game that sort of features players sort of playing their game in the franchise. It's another card game about card games, right? And although Wizards of the Coast had done their own entry in that particular space way back when Yu-Gi-Oh! Came out to rival that, which was Duel Masters, that sort of didn't really work in the Western world, but of course it was huge in Japan. So what happens is Bushiroad starts bringing out these sort of anime, sort of otaku sort of centric card games one by one, and sort of start and you've got Way Schwartz, which is licensed franchises. You've got Cardfight Vanguard, which is their own sort of IP that has an anime and stuff like that alongside it, and then they've got another sort of younger aiming one, sort of to rival that dual masters market, which is called Future Card Fight, Future Buddy Card Fight, something like that. Anyway, so ultimately in this era, the big three that we've talked about, Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh, and Pokemon, are reigning the Western market and everything like that. But under the surface, you've got these sort of anime-centric games, and a couple of other things start to come out. Things like Final Fantasy, things like Force of Will starts to come out of, I believe, Singapore and stuff like that. And then ultimately, we'll get to sort of where we're going to be talking about in a second. But that sort of stretches 10 years, basically 2008, 2009 to basically 2019, where there is no faith in the trading card game market in the American publisher sort of side, other than those big three that we talked about.
So you're saying that the rise of those types of games essentially is what culled collectible card games in the West for a period of a few years.
Absolutely. So essentially, like I said, everybody thought, and you know what? I was one of the guilty parties. Everybody thought the collectible trading card game model had been extinguished, except for those three. You had the two that were big IPs, be it Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! And you also had Magic, which had the immense inertia of basically leading the genre. So essentially, everybody else thought it's going to be foolish to try and challenge these guys. Let's try and do something that's more financially secure, more accessible for not only us as a publisher, but the player group as well, or at least they thought at the time. There is a ton of problems with the LCG model, but we don't need to get into that. And obviously as well, like they also thought that, hey, we can sort of manage the way we want to do things. We're not beholden to releasing every 3 or 4 months. We can sort of craft our sort of environment a lot easier, and we can sort of control things a bit better. So yeah, that honestly, the philosophy way back then for these publishers was that, what is the point? Like there's no point in doing a randomized game model when the three big ones are always going to capture the market. We need to try and invade this new space. And again, as I mentioned, I was guilty of this. And this is when CCG history started, because I was convinced that these games would just fall by the wayside and become an obscure blip in history, right? Like they would just become this weird little niche, unless you're Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, Magic, that nobody would explore. So if somebody wasn't talking about them at the time, nobody would remember them. Obviously, I and those publishers have been proven wrong.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because I started getting really into the board game and card game design space in around 2011, 2012. Mm-hmm. And as a kid, obviously with the success of Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon, my friends and I would draw our own cards. We'd make our own little card games. They were absolutely awful. But it was cool because I made this card and I would trade it with their cards, and it was like our own little game. And I've always had a fascination with trading card games, and it was actually the reason I got into game design. But I got in during a time, and it's funny that you mentioned that that's kind of like the lull in collectible card games, because I got in at a time when I was talking to people in the community, they were like, trading card game? No, you can't. You're going to waste your time. You're going to waste your money. You need to focus on the big new thing, which is deck building. It's the same thing, but better. Like you said, living card games. It's the same thing, but better, because you have all your cards and all this other stuff. And, I'm new to doing the whole design thing. So I decided to focus on other things. So where would you say that the third era kind of kicks in for collectible games?
So that sort of starts again. That third era is encompassing those sort of Bushiroad games, like that sort of. It's sort of like this almost like tumbleweed era for collectible card games. Now there is some amazing stuff that comes out in that time. The My Little Pony card game comes out, and the fascinating thing about that is it's a Hasbro property, but they don't release it through Wizards of the Coast, and that just tells you how big companies were looking at collectible card games at the time. They have this massive company, Wizards of the Coast, that makes trading card games, but they franchise out their own property to a different company to make that game. And it really just speaks, that embodies the fact that Hasbro didn't even have faith in the collectible card game model, despite the fact that Wizards of the Coast was one of their companies and Magic the Gathering was one of their properties. They've obviously 180'd on that now, but this era sort of starts to bring a whole bunch of super interesting stuff. And like I said, I see the third age, what the comic book collectors would call the Bronze Age, but I'm calling the third age of collectible games history is sort of like these Bushiroad things coming out in the West, and sort of these Japanese games keeping the fire alive as these other things start to come out. And speaking of Japanese games, what you have in this time is you have another game come out that is still enduring to this day, which is the Final Fantasy trading card game. It comes out in 2015 and essentially finds its niche and is able to be profitable in this sort of West world, amongst, maybe, 5% of stores, 10% of stores, or something like that are supporting that game. Also, you have, as I mentioned before, Force of Will, which is a hugely magic-inspired game that sort of came out from this era. And sort of where I see the end of this era sort of coming to an end is 2019. Like, it's interesting you said that, you got into game design in sort of this period where board games were the thing. And that's actually something from my definitions that I didn't really mention before about this third age is board game and Kickstarter and stuff like that was really starting to churn. Everything was like, oh, game groups are all they're interested in nowadays are different types of board games. You've got things like Catan has broken through, and then all of a sudden Pandemic breaks through. You've got cooperative board games, and then you've got Kickstarter, and all of these amazing board game properties start to go on. And the card gaming space is relegated to, deck building games and expandable or living card games. And what's really fascinating in this time is you've got a lot of people like myself, like you, who grew up and sort of got into hobby gaming because of these sort of collectible card games, because Pokemon, because Magic the Gathering, because Yu-Gi-Oh! Taught us how these sort of games interacted with each other and kept us interested and sort of taught us these basic, elements of mechanics and how things work together and sort of made us game designers by building our own decks. We're getting into this sort of thing. But everybody was very negative on trading card games at that time. And at the moment, that's not the case. But again, these cycles sort of come where you'll be like, all right, this is the hot gaming genre right now. That's not the hot gaming genre right now. And in this third wave period, obviously, like I said, there's a bunch of amazing stuff coming out. And that sort of ends with 2019. And what I should say is these sort of genres, I find like when you start a new genre, much like in comic books, whether it's Showcase number 4 with The Flash coming out, these genres, these sort of ages, these sort of ages are sort of spurned on by a new competitor entering the market. Magic the Gathering entered the hobby game market back in 93 and then started the first genre. Pokemon entered the mass market at that point and started the mass market sort of, IP-centric genre. The third age is a little bit quieter because it's essentially like, it's not what is, it's what isn't. But things that like, like I said, those Bushiroad sort of anime sort of inspired games are sort of laying dormant and sort of releasing in this period. And then you get to sort of what is the current age and will be the fourth age in the history books at the moment. So...
Right. And so you said third age ends in 2019, and I kind of have an idea of where this is going to go. 2019, next year we got 2020, and we know that year kind of spurned a lot of people with the extra time they had on their hands and things like that to pursue some of their passions, to pursue some of the things that they didn't have time to do. So you would consider this fourth age that started in 2019 to be the one that we're currently in, right?
That's correct. So essentially what we're seeing as far as specifically speaking to new trading card games, and we'll get into it in a second, and many people have characterized it as a trading card game or collectible card game renaissance. That is sort of brought on by, like you said, this time. And in fact, it's interesting. I spoke to somebody who created a collectible card game in the third wave in 2017. I spoke to a creator of the Genesis Battle of Champions collectible card game. Just shout out to Assad there. And we had this discussion. I can't remember if it's in our episode we did together on my podcast or if we just talked about it off camera. But it was really fascinating because both of us had the same idea. As 2017 and 2018 sort of started to roll around, we could see that one of the most fascinating things was almost all of the hobby gaming market was being largely supported by collectible games. And in fact, the moment that sort of woke me up to all this was when the market numbers for 2019 were published. And it told us that 43% of all hobby game store sales were in collectible card games or trading card games. And that sort of made me really realize that we're going to go through this new surge of collectible card games. And that's when I started making collectible CCG history a lot more public. I started to sort of get out there, in late 2019, 2020, and sort of start going through the churning because I thought we had another 2 or 3 years before everybody sort of starts to circle back to this sort of collectible card game phenomenon. But then, as you said, 2020 hits.
Right. And of course, with the supply issues and everything like that, and like you're mentioning, and I did listen to the episode, and I remember you guys speaking about that, but kind of having that inkling in 2017 and 2018 that this was around the corner, this resurgence, and that you felt like this was like a natural way that the hobby or the collectible space was going to go, and then it's just exacerbated by 2020 supply chain issues, people being at home, having a little bit more time to be creative and kind of work on projects, start projects, or finish projects that they may have already been working on. I think at this time you not only see a flood of these types of games, but you also see, of course, Pokemon, and that boomed like crazy. But you have a lot of these things kind of just becoming viral, more or less, like the pack openings and things like that. So yeah, let's run through this current era and see where we're at now, and then kind of how we got here.
So this current era really does start in early 2019. So this current era is really hard to define, and there's actually a game that I feel like walks the line between age 3 and age 4. And that is Argent Saga. So what happens is, for the first time ever, you have a Kickstarter game that is a collectible game that funds quite well. Before that, in the collectible trading card game space, because before that, everything in the sort of Kickstarter space, there had been a couple of examples that had achieved their funding, which might have been $20,000 or something like that. But what Argent Saga does at the beginning of 2019 is it's a bunch of sort of competitive Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh players getting together and designing their own sort of, it's a Magic-like, which is basically like a Magic the Gathering, not clone, but very similar. And it sort of uses some elements from Yu-Gi-Oh and stuff like that. They sort of combine their skills. And this sort of comes on a Kickstarter in 2019 and does really well. Obviously these people already have a big fan base and stuff like that. And it hits, I think, $150,000, $150,000, yeah. And basically this is seen as an outlier by the community and stuff like that, just because these people have their own base. And I feel like Argent Saga is really the first sort of wicket to fall down in this sort of pantheon of this new era we're going to enter. And what happens is, in 2019, actually something I was very privy to, being Australian, being very close to New Zealand, a new game sort of comes out of New Zealand as a full trading card game. It is acting as if it was, Legend of the Five Rings. It is doing full marketing, and that is Flesh and Blood. So Flesh and Blood is coming out. Argent Saga has hit Kickstarter. None of us know about COVID yet. And as you mentioned, COVID accelerates everything that we're talking about. And obviously, people shut down and get more time to spend with their hobbies. They get to go into their closets and dig out old cards that they had. There's a lot of spring cleaning going on. People are jumping online, watching content creators crack boxes that they've just found or just bought. And then you have, I'm not going to go into it here, but the Logan Paul of it all, that sort of drives the collectible games market into a frenzy, from all these dormant people sort of gathering up and sort of being, clandestine, which was the exact opposite to what the hobby market thought it was going to do. I remember tweeting in, March of 2020, when we were all shutting down, something along the lines of, oh, well, this is not the year for trading card games, or something along those lines, right? Like, this is not going to be the sort of year I was hoping it to be for trading card games. And then, fast forward 8 months later, and it's absolutely wild. And what we're seeing now, I'm sort of abridging this, but what we're seeing now in this current age is sort of designers, like yourself, or like independents who have grown up playing these games, who were interested in game design, but were always told collectible card games are not the way to go, sort of come out in this sort of era and sort of go to Kickstarter or crowdfunding platforms to sort of drive their dreams forward and sort of make these new games and sort of realize these projects that they'd had sort of kicking around in their head. And they're encouraged by these sort of factors that we haven't talked about. We're encouraged by the fact that hobby gaming somehow accelerates during this sort of lockdown period. There's a lot of speculation in the collectible games market, brought on by, some factors that I earlier mentioned. It's really fascinating to see that there's a lot of that between Flesh and Blood, which is sort of the first real sort of Western collectible card game, to sort of get a lot of optics on it at the time, and sort of be in the right spot at the right time. And it's a fabulous game. I'm not saying that it was all luck. But being in the right spot at the right time just before COVID hit and sort of being in the market sort of allowed it to permeate further than I think it could have otherwise. It might have got there eventually, but I feel like it sort of boomed out because people were looking for these new hobbies to engage in. Content creators like Team Covenant started covering it. Content creators who are into more the financial side started covering it. And it sort of boomed as well. And a lot of store owners who literally were doing store side pickups were learning about these new games, and they got excited by this. In the wake of that as well, another game comes to Kickstarter. Another really indie trading card game comes to Kickstarter called MetaZoo. It does really, really well. Like, it doesn't do very well on Kickstarter, but eventually, as the sort of the collectible games market starts to churn in the COVID lockdown, much more than we thought it would, especially sort of on the financial side of things, it takes off as well, and it gets a lot of eyes. And guess what gets news stories? Dollar signs get news stories. So that sort of generates this. These two things are sort of pushing the proverbial hamster wheel and sort of get the whole collectible card game genre spinning again. I remember in April of 2020. Maybe just after lockdown, I had a major trading card game personality tell me to my face that no trading card game would ever survive on Kickstarter or ever be successful or ever get over $100,000 on Kickstarter because it's just not a viable medium for that particular genre. And we've seen since then, literally, I haven't tracked it exactly, but at least between 8 and 10 get more than that.
And so with the age that we're currently in, and it being, we talk about people kind of getting back into their passions, getting back into their hobbies, finding more time to discover those things. How much of it do you think is driven by these games being solid, good games as far as gameplay goes, and the way that the creators have built up a community and everything to really endure, versus things being propped up by speculation, things being propped up by people who are like, is this the next big thing? Do I need to jump in on this now? Where's that driving force for you? Where do you see that?
So this is a really complicated question. The reason being is I believe in a lot of these creators. There is a lot of these creators out there who I believe grew up in the same way that I grew up, playing different collectible card games or playing Magic or playing Pokemon, or having their favorite ones, and always dreaming like, oh, if I was in charge of this, I would do this slightly differently. And there is a lot of games coming out like that. Like MetaZoo has a lot of tendons that were very familiar to both Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, and Magic the Gathering. I believe in these creators, but I do believe that there is a lot of these creators who, of all of those 10 or so $100,000 Kickstarters I just mentioned, I'm pretty sure every single one was from a first-time creator. And that obviously is a cause for concern. We talked about how difficult collectible card games are to balance, to engage with. They're a huge thing, and you need a lot of capital to sort of start spinning those wheels, especially if people are expecting it to do the same thing that every collectible card game does. Now, we can sort of talk about a little bit later about sort of what it means to be a cottage collectible card game, or the way I've coined it, a boutique collectible card game. But if you're comparing these sorts of games to the ones that we saw in the early 2000s, if you're talking about ones that we wanted to compare to some of the, like Legend of the Five Rings, like, Magic the Gathering, like Yu-Gi-Oh, like Pokemon, like the Star Wars customizable card game, there is a lot that goes into managing a game like that. And these first-time creators and these people who are getting literally hundreds of thousands of dollars, which long-time creators can't do, on places like Kickstarter, are going to have to meet those expectations at some point or manage them in an interesting way. So this new era, I feel like, does replicate in some ways, and we didn't really get into it because we didn't have enough time, but that sort of 1995 boom where we saw a lot of games come out, but not a lot of ability to support them because the companies didn't have the know-how of how to support them. And honestly, the game stores didn't have the space or the time to sort of support them the way a collectible card game should be supported. Now, I do find that Flesh and Blood in this era is an outlier because they are indeed a company that has been built on the idea of, for the last apparently 7 years, they are going to create a trading card game, and they come from people who have worked in organized play, and they've come from everything like that. So I do have a lot of hope for that particular game. But in the essence of these independently created trading card games, I do feel like there's going to be a lot of I do feel like there may have been a lot of speculation in the last sort of year and a half. That means we're going to have the same expectations on them as we're going to do on, say, Magic and stuff like that. And that could be a huge issue for them moving forward. I do feel like a lot of the interest in trading card game space has been propped up by speculation, by extreme rarity, by collectability, and not by games in and of themselves. And if we look back at the history, and we didn't even go into it in this episode, but the history of the way that rarity sort of works with collectible card games and stuff like that, that in itself isn't enough to drive people to your game. You know, you've got to have a game, you've got to have something that's lasting. There's a reason that Black Lotus is the most valuable card in Magic the Gathering, because it is the best gameplay card. Not just because it can make 3 mana, but because everybody loves Magic the Gathering and wants to be able to make 3 mana. It doesn't matter if your game has a card that says, let's make 10 mana, or whatever your game's equivalent of that is, if nobody plays it. That's still just as uninteresting as the very next card that your game has.
And so you would say that where we're currently at, we are kind of in this era where you have a lot of games from independent creators that are getting funded, that are getting their initial 1, maybe 2 or more print runs, and getting out these, you know, booster boxes and things like that. And whether they've built the communities, which I feel like they would have had to a certain extent before going to Kickstarter, and then kind of building communities through Kickstarter and beyond that. Do you see kind of this being the model moving forward as far as new games entering the market? Because I know there's a difference between what Assad did with Genesis, where he built what Genesis is himself, and then he was like, okay, I believe now it's time to expand this because we feel comfortable doing it and we want to go to Kickstarter, and that's what we want to do. Versus something else where it's like, this started off as a homemade TCG. You know, the community has very much been part of it, and then now, you know, we're gonna launch the official cards and the official game through Kickstarter. Is that how you see a lot of these new entries to the market going?
Well, I mean, I think that Assad is one of 2 special outliers in this era. I think Assad has sort of more of that, as I mentioned before, that Legend of the Five Rings vibe, where he has built up this amazing community, and he has also sort of spurned on this sort of engaged sort of central community that he can build off. Whereas a lot of these other Kickstarter games are basically being, if you look at them mathematically, it's really worrying, because you're seeing, you know, $500,000 for a lot of these games as a baseline, let's say, and about 1,200 backers. I would guarantee you that all of those backers are the same 1,200 backers across X amount of games, and that $500,000 is coming from the same pockets, which doesn't really speak to the way that you want to fund a collectible card game. Now, if all of those backers are card stores who are going to intend to hold events and share their product with other people, and not people who are ordering it to speculate on it later, hoping that other card stores will do the work for them, that's a problem. Like, that's a problem if they're all just people trying to ride this wave. You're gonna see the big crashes. Like, there was, you know, like I said, speaking to history, there was a bunch of games that came out in early 1995, mid 1995, with cards worth in excess of, at the time, what was expensive, which was $30, $40, $50. And then by the end of that year, those cards were in a discount bin for for 10 cents each.
Yeah, something that I learned from one of your episodes was the average price that a backer on one of these Kickstarters puts forward. I think, you know, maybe in the range of $700 to $1,000, and you know, not the average backer's doing that. So, like you said, you have these whale investors essentially that are dumping a bunch of money into this game. And on one hand, okay, cool, it's getting funded for you can push out a lot of product. But 2, if they're just sitting on the product and not engaging with it and just kind of waiting to see where that value goes, then, you know, is your game successful because financially people are speculating on cards and their cards are going for a lot of money? Or is your game successful because you had more backers at a lower average backing rate, basically having more players that are going to keep that game going? So given where we're at now and the whole history of the collectible card game market, what, in your opinion, would you consider a successful trading card game?
So, this question was much easier to ask in the pre-independent era, which is basically what we're in now. We're in this independent era where essentially creators can go directly to the communities that they're building and ask them for money rather than circumventing the three-tier model, which for those people who don't know is retail, distributor, publisher. So, what we're going to be talking about here is what we've historically seen as a collectible card game success. And it's really hard to amalgamate that with what's happening in the current day because so much has changed. Now, there is one example of success, and we're going to go back to that in a second. But let's just talk generally what we've seen over the 3 ages that meant successful. So, in trading card games, there is this convention, this myth, this superstition called the 2-year curse. And if a collectible card game can last over 2 years, it essentially has its own momentum. So basically what that means is over the time that collectible card games have existed, the capital that typically an investor will put in or typically a publisher will put in is enough to sort of churn the game for 2 years. Now, this isn't always the case. Usually, it's only the case if the game has some initial interest. Now, the initial input, what you'll usually see from a publisher from a game that immediately is basically dead on arrival, is 1 or 2 sets. Because usually they're planning the second set by the time the first set comes out, and they've done the work. So essentially, once I did a grid that did the first 2 ages of TCG history, and it showed how many games lasted X amount of years. And there was a huge, huge taper off when it comes to over 3 years and over. So although it's superstitious, there is some merit to that particular timeline, because if a game isn't making money from a particular company standpoint, they will cut it off. Now, success in the olden days, I would consider anywhere between sort of 4 and 5 years. Obviously, if a game is out there, I mean, you're selling pieces of cardboard for $6 or $7 a pack, you can make a profit on that. Obviously, if you're building on a license, you need to be paying license fees, and that is a problem. And you obviously got to pay for storage and warehousing and obviously creation of art and designing. So there is a lot of capital that goes into creating a collectible card game. But for success, and to label that, it's very, very vague and variable depending on the game. You know, over the last couple of years, we have seen a bunch of collectible card games from sort of the middle of that third era to now that have sort of endured by being aware of what their print run is, by being aware of what their player base is, and not printing over what they would do that, you know, we sort of saw in the 90s era where they all expected to sort of do the sort of things that Magic were doing or a little bit less or something like that. You know, games like, you know, like we mentioned Wage Wars, like we mentioned Final Fantasy, like we mentioned, you know, Dragon Ball Super has now been going for 4 or 5 years, the card game version of that. And you know, Bandai has now got Digimon and stuff like that. Now, we haven't really talked about those sort of games that are coming in from Japan in this particular model again, but the success is there in a more incremental way that was the early part of the sort of early TCG ages, the first and the second age in particular, where there was a lot more guesswork as far as print run goes. There was a lot more guesswork as far as licensing fees go, that actually made those games die out. Now, the other thing that's really propped up those games in more recent times is the fact that we are all so connected on social media, whether it's Discord, whether it's Facebook, whether it's forums or whatever. There's always been those sort of things in the collectible game space, but nowadays we can sort of get spurned on. Like a great example is the Transformers trading card game, which was from Wizards of the Coast a couple of years ago. They started only in 2018. It died in the wake of the pandemic. But those cards have never like dropped down to, you know, $10 a box or anything like that, because the community is still spurned on by things like Facebook groups, by Discord servers, by people who are making custom cards, all these sort of like player committees that are driving the game forward. Success doesn't feel the same as what it did once before. Now, there's 2 really special games that we're going to talk about, I think, in this space that did some really interesting things. So one of the most enduring collectible card games or trading card games that people probably don't know has been out only 2 years less than Magic and is still going to this day is a game called Redemption. Now, what Redemption is Redemption is a Christian trading card game. It doesn't get sold in hobby stores. It doesn't get sold in mass market stores. It gets sold in Christian bookstores. And essentially, it doesn't have a release schedule. It comes out when the creator's ready. And it's sort of the model that I see these new sort of indie trading card games going through, where it sort of knows how big its market is. It knows how big its player base is. It knows it's not really changing. And it will just only service those particular markets in that particular time. And there's another game as well that's another, ironically, Christian game that has been going since 2012 or 2013, Exodus. And that's the same thing. It's got its market. It's got its very niche side of hobby gaming. And it releases sets at its own time. And I feel like that's what success is going to look like moving forward for these Kickstarter games. Unless the creator or the community gives up on a particular game because it is propped up purely by that speculation and there's nothing interesting there, it's going to survive basically during this period because it can actually stay connected with its community. It can drive that further. There can be games played, via webcam in some cases or via, tabletop simulator in some cases. There's always going to be that interest there. And we're going to have this more cottage, or as I mentioned before, boutique trading card game come out of this particular era that I think we have not seen before. And that's, I feel like, where success is really, really living, though, in this sort of modern era.
Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely right about what success is defined as now, being how properly can you scale your game, your production runs, everything to fit your community without overextending yourself. Because anybody who's really looked into the numbers of these things, it's a fun industry to be in, but the margins are, what they are. So when you take into consideration printing costs, shipping, marketing, all that stuff, I mean, you're dealing with physical products in an ever-changing digital world.
Well, the interesting thing as well is, to mention, just incremental growth or whatnot. There's a ton of board games that came to life over this sort of Kickstarter generation. If we look at what happened since 2011 being the sort of the big wave of Kickstarter board games, there is a bunch of people who are working, their own personal jobs that are creating their expansions for these games that have been, moderately successful on Kickstarter and, are incrementally sort of just bringing their same market back, maybe growing a little bit each year, maybe dipping off a little bit each year as people, people's lifestyles changes, as the people who they're, catering to get more interested, less interested, spread word of mouth. That's really where we're going to sit. And I think, I come from a film background, and basically I think what we're going to see is we're sort of seeing this sort of indie era for trading card games and collectible card games, in the same way we saw sort of an indie era come through in the late 80s and early 90s. People will know the names like Quentin Tarantino in film and stuff like that, who came up as a independent creator. And I feel like those sort of same twinges that sort of drove that industry forward and sort of drove that interest will be what happens nowadays with collectible games. Obviously, collectible games have to be talked about and sort of have to be like this lifestyle game. But incrementally, year on year, if word of mouth can spread, it will be like, as we mentioned a couple of times, Legend of the Five Rings, where it could sustain in-store play. It could sustain sort of a fan or, for lack of a better word, cult following that has not been seen in this industry really before.
Mm-hmm. Well, in regards to success and things that have kind of spurned on these eras and spurned on these peaks and valleys throughout the past 30 years, what are some major innovations that stand out that have kind of driven some of these things?
So innovation in the trading card game space is constant. There's everything from set to set. As a living game, obviously collectible card games keep evolving, keep growing, but there's a billion things that we could talk about here. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have time to dig into all of them, but everything like product packaging, like the way that we distribute product has changed irrevocably since the very beginning. Magic, to some people's probably surprise, originally came in starter decks that were randomized. There was no like 2-player introductory starter set. It was just like, here's a randomized brick of cards. You figure it out. It's whatever you can get. You got X amount of lands and, it's a crap deck, but you've got to buy your own booster packs to build on it. In, I believe, one of the earliest examples of this, Overpower, which was a comic book based trading card game way back in the mid 90s, was one of the first card games to sort of go, right, no, if we're going to be introducing people to our game, let's stop right there and give them a specific set of cards so that, you can get into the vibe of what our game is and then grow your collection out of that. So that's a big thing. The way that we've introduced people to the way that we play games as far as the trading card game distribution and sort of product sales model goes is a huge innovation in trading card game space. Another innovation, I mean, when Magic the Gathering came out, we expect it to have all of these things on it. You know, things like organized play, things like limited card pools and stuff like that. Magic didn't have any of that. It didn't know what it was doing. It took whiles to grow into that. So Magic the Gathering spearheaded organized play with things like, at first, world tournaments and then, regional tournaments. And eventually they brought out the Pro Tour and all that sort of stuff and sort of spearheaded what organized play was. Another thing was limited gameplay. Magic the Gathering, again, being an industry leader, was the first to sort of really tailor itself to limited gameplay, which, for those who don't know, is a huge part of the way you can sell booster packs. And for people who might be listening to your show hoping to design their own collectible card game, is an intensely important way to look at your collectible card game because it makes a functionality mechanically out of your own game's rarity. And what happens is essentially you open up a number of booster packs or you draft a number of booster packs and you can play a game with the cards in the pool. And if you don't, like many of the early collectible card games had an even balance of, mechanically sound cards in a particular booster pack, as Magic calls it, as fanned different elements of cards, whether that's the 5 different colors of Magic or, all the tent poles that you need to properly play your game. Your limited play is garbage. And that is a whole extra vector of collectible card games that has evolved out of Magic's sort of spearhead. It wasn't until what I've deemed as the second age that other sort of companies really jumped on that limited play bandwagon. And Magic was sort of doing it in like as early as 1996, really. They sort of dabbled with it earlier, but that was when they really started designing specifically for it. Other things have really helped the industry grow. Things like accessories, like playmats and sleeves were not something that were coming out of the very, very, very early days of collectible games. And that's helped propped up the business. If you have a card game and you can sell tailored sleeves for either your mana color or your resource points or anything like that, that's something that's really honed and shaped the industry because that's more things that people can engage with. It can help bring in revenue and all that sort of stuff as well. There is a ton of stuff. Obviously, we talked about rarity before. Rarity has been innovated time upon time upon time again. We've just seen Magic the Gathering go through bringing out, literally, as of the next set, it's going to be 7 different types of booster packs for different types of rarity for their next set. But this isn't the first time. Even going back to the second trading card game, which you mentioned before, which was Spellfire by TSR, they were the first company to do chase cards, that were doing more than just rare, uncommon, rare. They were like rare, uncommon, rare, uncommon, rare, and then another sort of chase rarity to that as well. So there's been these tons of innovations, and there's going to be so many more sort of specific innovations that are going to happen in the future. And we didn't even go into the fact that, collation has changed so much. So nowadays, back in the old days, it was basically all track printing, which is, for those who don't know, is basically meaning that you're putting cards in a booster pack in a specific order to make it look like it's random. It's not actually random. But nowadays you can do true random because there's digital printing, which wasn't possible before when they were printing with printing plates. There's so many examples of how trading card games have innovated over the years and so many weird, obscure points where usually it is either Magic, Pokemon, or Yu-Gi-Oh! Innovating in a way and then everybody catching up to them, or a smaller trading card game innovating and then one of those big games sort of going, hey, that looks like a good idea. I don't want to get into it, but obviously there's things like stickered cards coming out in the very near future. There's things like, this is ridiculous and personally something I'm not into, but NFT ownership impacting physical trading card games coming forward in the future. So there is a dozen different ways that trading card games have innovated in the past 30 years. And sort of interestingly, you can lock them down as specific games, but you can't really look at them as specific fads throughout the same ages that we did at the beginning of this episode.
And like you said, there's countless innovations of varying levels. And I think the introduction of games like Hearthstone, digital TCGs, basically it gave you the same kind of thing that you could get from the physical product, but on a digital platform. And it being a digital platform allowed you to do certain things you couldn't do with physical cards. So have digital card games brought more people that weren't already in the hobby into the hobby and thus into the physical part of the hobby? Or did they maybe take those that were already in it on the physical card game side and kind of shift over to playing mostly digital? So basically, was it a benefit or a detriment to the physical side of collectible card games?
Absolutely, it was a fully like it wouldn't seem this way, but is 100% irrevocably an improvement for physical card games. If somebody is playing something digitally, they are way more likely to be able to feel the confidence to go to the store to buy the physical cards. And we've seen this throughout history. And I sort of actually I'm glad you brought this up because I alluded to it before, and I thought we wouldn't have time to talk about it. But one of the big things that spurned Yu-Gi-Oh to change its rules from that season 1 to season 2 was the fact that they needed to make a specific line of trading card games for, I think at the time it was Game Boy or PlayStation or something like that. So they needed to solidify the rules in a way that hadn't been solidified before. And the fact that many kids like myself were able to try out those games through ROMs, through Game Boy Advance games, and sort of understand how the rules work before dipping their toe in the physical space, sort of investing, is something that's really brought waves and waves of people into the physical trading card game space and more comfortable. Now, when digital trading card games started with, like, say, Spectrum or Chromium, way back in 1997, the opinion was the opposite. But it wasn't to be true. Like, everybody thought, oh, the fact that these digital assets could be traded and stuff like that, and not to get off on the topic, but trading card game and collectible card game are different things in the digital space, where they're not really that different in the physical space. But that's a whole other episode. But what happens basically is, even for me, I learned to play Pokemon at my peak because of the Game Boy version of that game, and that made me more confident to go play competitively. And a lot of people felt the same way about Yu-Gi-Oh, right? We could try out this game on our Game Boys and go into it. And if you exacerbate that, Magic has had some serious Magic the Gathering, obviously industry leader, has had some real growth periods in the last sort of last 15 years. And what really spurned that? They've had Magic Online forever. They've had Magic Online since, I believe, 2002, maybe 2003. But what really spurned their sales in the physical side was when they introduced Duels of the Arena, or Planeswalkers of the Arena, or Duel of the Planeswalkers is what it's called. And that was a digital game where it taught you how to play Magic on Xbox. It taught you how to play Magic on PlayStation. And what we saw is, after 2000, sort of 2007, 2008 was sort of a lull period for Magic. We saw it become this huge behemoth as things like Zendikar hit, as they sort of started streamlining their card game rules and incorporating their digital play into a more accessible form of physical play. So you had all these people learning how to play through Duels of the Planewalkers, or whatever it was called, and joining the hobby market because these digital games existed. And what we saw in the pandemic, the reason Magic's best-selling set in the last 2 or 3 years was not exclusively this reason, but one of the best reasons was Kamigawa, is it was the first set to really offer wide game store play after a bunch of people had jumped onto the game through Magic Arena during COVID times when they couldn't be playing, but they were confident to come out because they'd learned how to play through these digital platforms. And games like Hearthstone make people more confident to engage in this hobby physically. Because ultimately, what do we want as humans? We want that human emotional connection. I mean, some people are going to prefer digital. Some people are going to prefer just to be faceless names in online poker rooms. You know what I mean? Like, what is actually different here is that these give people an option to come experience it physically. And I think I was going to bring this up later, but I feel like one of the biggest innovations in trading card games is offering a digital form for your game, because that's where people can play, where people can experience it. Like, Pokemon has done nothing but improve year on year ever since they launched Pokemon trading card game online, because people can go in and play against, like, the faux gym leaders, the AI in that, where you can't do that in a game store, but you know all the rules before you get to that store and go in and not feel like a fool and not feel silly for doing that, because you're familiar with not only the card pool, but also the rules and the way that mechanics work in a more regimented, computerized space.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. I just, to your point, I really appreciate that you have a lot of these publishers and such that are creating these digital portions of the game, and maybe not even being programmed to be games, but having a digital version, like on Tabletop Simulator or those other platforms. Digitally and on all those other options, I think are, to your point, are getting a lot of more people into the space because they're feeling so confident in doing so. Was there any other innovations that stand out in this whole 30-year stretch?
There is dozens of actual innovations, and there's been a bunch of innovations that have really changed the industry. You mentioned Pokemon going from Pokemon Online to Pokemon Live, and then Magic obviously has Arena, and then recently Yu-Gi-Oh has Master Duels, I think it's called. They've all revamped their digital formats, and I only see that as spurning more and more players in the trading card game space in the years to come. So to those designers out there who are excited and who want to create their own trading card game, you are going to have more eyes on your product than ever before in the years to come. But speaking to real innovations, not just sort of like the stuff that we talked about, like the evolutions that have happened over the last 30 years, but some of the innovations that have actually changed the face of the industry. I mean, things have changed so much since the games that I'm most sort of invested in sort of started to come out. Those early 90s games. Basically, mechanics got streamlined. You had things like keywords evolve out of Magic, out of other games and stuff like that. You saw in the early years of collectible card games, if you pick up a bunch of them, they have rule books that basically feel like role-playing books because they are so jam-packed and so complicated to try and emulate these stories. There's examples like the Star Wars customizable card game where you can basically tell any story you want in the Star Wars universe, but you have to learn literally thousands of different rules and exceptions just to start playing that game. But nowadays, it all becomes about that experience first. We mentioned before about starter sets and two-player starter sets. Rules have become more streamlined. Mechanics have become more streamlined. The entire gaming experience has really innovated. Some other things that have come out is like, we didn't start this way, but decks have gotten smaller. Deck size limits have come in. The number of cards that you can play have really come in. Digital versions we mentioned before, obviously, was something that really sort of cemented the communities. And I know we're running out of time, but obviously things like content creation, box breaks, forum, like as we mentioned before, Discords and Facebook groups have evolved out of things like forums. And there's so many more eyes on specific games nowadays. And these digital components and these digital ways that people can engage with your game through content is so much more important, like what we're making right now. It's so valuable to content creators and trading card game creators to be working in step if they really want to have that sort of success and keep that engagement and keep those sort of boutique trading card games going, because there's always going to be content for those big three. There's always going to be content for some of those stronger games, but really sort of nurturing your audience and sort of presenting them with content. And again, to call somebody out who's doing a great job, Assad, despite maybe only getting, 100 views an episode or whatever, does a content every single week and is present for his audience and stuff like that, and is available and accessible and is always online and is always answering questions and is always engaged. And I think that that's really where the next trading card game sort of breaks out of this indie era, that goes from this sort of garage band sort of Kickstarter into the stratosphere, is really going to find their footing. And, there's games already doing that in some part.
And speaking of the games already doing that in some part, especially with the newer ones coming out, and we're seeing all the different mechanics and different takes on some of the same mechanics that have worked over the years. Let's go into what do you view as the most promising game coming up that has been released in plus or minus the last 5 years?
So there's a lot of exciting games. Obviously, I want to call out creators like Assad, like we mentioned here. Like we said, we are in an indie era, and there's a lot of exciting things coming out. And we didn't really dive into it, but I would suggest your listeners go check it out. But I have a bunch of opinions on the future of sort of licensed trading card games, because we are going to see more licensed trading card games coming out, but different to the way that we've discussed so far. But what I'm excited about of the games that we've seen sort of announced, I'm excited about a licensed trading card game. I'm excited for the One Piece trading card game coming out from Bandai. Bandai seems to be going through a little bit of a resurgence with Digimon, with Dragon Ball Super. Hopefully they can sort of turn their wheels and do something that they've never been able to do during the previous eras and sort of get something here. But the real answer to your question right there is Sorcery. Sorcery Contested Realms is a collectible game that is by the graphic or art designer of Path of Exile, which is I think a free-to-play sort of online game. And basically what they've done is they've taken their passion for early Magic the Gathering and distilled it into this great grid-based game that is coming out, I believe, at the end of the year. It's going to be, we mentioned it before, it did the most money out of all of these contemporary games on Kickstarter, and I don't believe that was an investor thing. I do believe there was part of that, but I believe it achieved crossover to the board game audience, to the less speculative audience. It had 4,700 in backers, which is over three times whatever all of those other Kickstarter era games have held, and they are propping themselves up as a boutique game. They're not going to have releases every week. They're not going to have releases every month. They're not going to have releases every quarter. They're going to do one release a year, and they are going to be basically doing this sort of like more domestic thing. They're not supporting organized play. They are very much aware of what they are, and they're very much sort of catering to a more board game centric crowd, where it's like it's a collectible game experience, but more casual, more, like I said, accessible for sort of more board gamers. They're not going to be supporting these crazy organized play metas and stuff like that, like we expect from many collectible card games nowadays. I am excited to watch their business model in the collectible game space, because as we're growing up, we're seeing these new approaches to collectible games sort of take hold, and I can't wait to see sort of if they can, survive and become, like this cottage industry, this boutique industry that really isn't worried about, making sure they've got booster packs in every game store, that aren't really worried that the fans know who they are. Maybe it's word of mouth that helps them grow. They do spectacular art as well. All the art is hand painted, so it takes literally a year to get a set out because of all of those sort of elements. That's sort of what I'm most excited about. Now, just before we wrap up, I also mentioned that Flesh and Blood does excite me, but not for the conventional reasons. Now, Flesh and Blood has announced that they're going to be doing something really unique, which is player versus environment, which is a new way of playing really collectible card games. There's been some examples in the past, but this is the first time a real major collectible card game has said that, hey, we want to create this sort of cooperative play experience amongst the players that we have, so that they can start to play it more like a board game experience, more like a pandemic board game, more like, Horrified, or any of those sort of thousands and thousands of cooperative board games, and sort of bring a new meaning to these collectible card game that we get, but sort of experiencing it sort of like we've done with sort of the living card games that come out from Fantasy Flight nowadays, like, Lord of the Rings or Arkham Horror or anything like that. And lastly, there is one specific game I'm super excited about, but it's not collectible, and that's Earthborn Rangers. If nobody knows it, go check it out. It is a fantastic looking game that really is a not collectible, but it is a expandable card game. And basically what it does is it's striving to be the first ever sort of sustainable card game as far as environmental goes. So they're doing everything like with recycled paper. They're doing everything with as far as like, manufacturing, and they're doing only local manufacturing and stuff like that. It's a real special experience. I feel like it does deserve a call out, despite the fact it's not in the collectible space. It's sort of adjacent. Something I'm super excited about.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the next steps I'm looking forward to, is seeing how companies innovate in terms of being environmentally friendly, especially with, box openings and pack openings and things like that, creating a lot of waste. I'm really curious to see where that's going to go. But before we close this up, do you have any closing thoughts on the entire 30-year span of the collectible card game history, or maybe where you see it going from here?
So there is a lot of interesting things going in the trading card game space. I mentioned PvE from Flesh and Blood, and Magic the Gathering is obviously embracing Commander. Casual play is something that's going to become a reality in trading card games, that like we haven't seen before. Another thing as well is direct to consumer, which is something that's coming out from things like Magic in the Secret Lair products. MetaZoo, as we mentioned earlier, is doing a lot of this sort of direct to consumer stuff, and I think that that's going to be a huge part of the way major trading card games sort of work moving forward. The hobby stores are going to become an and rather than a necessity to some of the way that some of these new trading card games are coming up in the future. As for collectible card games in general, the future is bright. As we said, Pokemon Live, Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duels, Magic Arena is every single day indoctrinating people into collectible card games. Not just people who grew up watching the shows, but new people every single day. So if you're a card game designer, now is the time to jump on this bandwagon, is the time to really get the wheels spinning on your project, because there is going to be more people who are going to be interested in this market, and more, and see more value in it as a personal enjoyment space, and be more comfortable with it than there has ever been before. Back when we were talking in the first age, it was about enticing people over from role playing or grabbing new people wholesale. But nowadays, you don't have to do that. Somebody can jump onto an app store and buy or grab Magic Arena or any of those other apps and start playing, or even Hearthstone, and sort of get the principles of how collectible and trading card games work. And we're only going to see this giant boom. Collectible card games, I think, are going through a period where they're starting to become mainstream in the same way comics did 20, 30, 40 years ago, and becoming sort of like a big thing, especially with these big tickets, big ticket prices making news stories and stuff like that. They're no longer like this kiddie, nerdy, super thing that we saw them as, 20 or 30 years ago as well. And I really am excited about this sort of new generation of collectible card games, and there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff happening to say, digital space versus collectible space and all that sort of stuff, and the way that these games intertwine. The last sort of thoughts I want to sort of leave the listeners of this show to, which I assume would be people wanting to create their own trading card game, is two things. First of all, we've talked about a lot of games nowadays, today specifically, and most of them are nearly impossible to get. They're so hard to track down, or, the prices are through the roof. Yeah, you can get bulk lots, but they might not give you key cards and stuff like that. I would just encourage people, you mentioned before how valuable it was to have digital play experiences, print and play digital experiences. These games are always listed on, somebody's usually made like a tabletop simulator app, and there's always groups that people will jump into, whether it's Discords or anything like that, who are very happy to teach people how to play these games. And all of these card images, almost for every game, are available to print and play online. And this is something that really helped me, especially as a traveler nowadays who can't collect everything, who wants to try all these different games. You can print and play a whole bunch of games. I remember I sold my PlayStation 4 for a printer, and I've had more fun with the printer than I have with the PlayStation 4 over the last few years, because I've been able to experience a whole bunch of games, or cards for games that I've never been able to experience before by proxying. So my definite thoughts are proxy, obviously, and if you're obviously a trading card game creator, just to self-plug very very scrupulously, I have an episode about HTCGs, which, if you don't know, is a homemade trading card game, and it's about the community that's built up around that. And there's a lot of support in those spaces for people who are wanting to create their own collectible card game, be it one of these indie games, these indie rock band type games that become, the next big superstar, or be it just something you want to play test with your friends. People in this community have got a ton of experience and are very, very willing to share that experience with people looking to try and create their own collectible games.
All right. Well, Rands, I know you said we could speak on some of these topics for 3 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours. And I wish I could, because I've been fascinated by everything you've been saying. I've actually learned so much just from our conversation here. But I appreciate you coming on the show. I appreciate you speaking on the history of trading card games and collectible card games. And I think that as things move on, people that have been paying attention to, like you said, the different eras, the different ages of this industry, are going to see a lot of interesting things start to change and start to come about, like you mentioned, the casual play and things like that. But all right. So I appreciate you coming on the show, and thanks for your time.
No problem. Thank you very much for the invite. I hope we get to talk again.
Alrighty, episode 2 is in the bag, and that was the different eras of TCG history, presented, of course, by Rands Lincoln, and he goes into depth on this content fully in his own podcast, which is the Booster Pack Throwback, previously known as the Booster Pack. So, if you want any more content, or if you want to kind of connect with the community and talk about some of these things that we discussed in this episode, or otherwise, feel free to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at TBPN Content, and our website is theboosterpacknetwork.com. If you want to reach out to me specifically, my email is j@theboosterpacknetwork.com. All right, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.